this is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I'm wearing one of my fancy booktube hats, and today I'm doing a much belated wrap-up for this past summer's reading rush. The reading rush is the book event formerly known as the Booktubeathon. This year it ran from July 22nd through 28th. It's always a week-long reading event. I aimed to read the full 7 books that was the, sort of bonus goal this year. I did not. I read 5, but other than that, I hit all of the other challenges. I considered, because I am so behind on my wrap-ups, doing all of July as one wrap-up instead of separating it into 2 videos. That's going to get me even further behind, but I read so many things in July that just was not going to be feasible. In addition to the 5 books that I read for the reading rush, I read, let me count them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 other books. So there was no way I was doing that all in one wrap-up. Is that right? Is that 7? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah, it was in the midst of Hugo reading and all of that, so yeah, it must have been my most productive reading month this year by like a mile. So anyways, I'm actually hoping to legitimately keep this wrap-up fairly short, because not only were a bunch of the things that I read for the reading rush shorter, I was also reading them faster. I was rushing to get through things during the week, and I maybe didn't sit with these books quite as deeply and as much as I normally would. So the first thing I read was The White Road of the Moon by Rachel Neumeier, which is a standalone young adult novel that was published in 2017. It is a pretty traditional high fantasy world, and I was intrigued by the fact that this book purportedly had no romance, and it doesn't. That's correct. This is about an orphaned girl named Meredy who comes from a small town. She lives with her aunt at the beginning of the book, who is going to sell her into a terrible apprenticeship that she doesn't want. Meredy can see ghosts, which is pretty much the basis for the magic system in this book. But she pretends not to because there's a lot of fear of people with magic. People will think she's a witch. At the beginning of the book, she has an encounter with a ghost boy and a traveling stranger who basically seem to see her as destined for something. So she heads off, she runs away. On a perilous journey, she is accompanied by the ghost boy's ghost dog. She joins up with some other travelers and acquires some traveling companions, both living and dead. There is what I think is meant to be a really strong friendship story between Meredy and another girl that I ultimately found to be underwhelming and not particularly fulfilling. And basically, I think my biggest frustration with this book is how long it goes before any of the main characters really have any clue what's going on, which is also what makes it a hard book to talk about. I think we were maybe halfway through the book, and a lot of really strange things had happened when the characters kind of all gathered together and said, okay, now can we figure out what the heck is happening? And I'm like, yeah, I would also like to know. Ultimately, the story revolves around the region's history and some magic that's woven into it, and like royalty, princes and princesses of today and long ago. And once you know what's going on towards the end, some of these big magical stakes and the way they're written feels very classic and very beautiful, and that's what I liked most about this book. But I'm not really sure it was worth everything that it took to get there. I gave this book 3 stars. This is the second book of Neumeier's that I've read. The first was one of her 2 adult novels, The Mountain of Kept Memory. And I liked that one better than this one because the characters in that book were just absolutely ferociously intelligent in a way that made reading about them a lot of fun, and I thought that was missing here. But I will keep reading her books. It's possible that her adult writing is more for me than her YA. I have had to awaken Esme because she was under my bed snoring very loudly. You, super distracting. You a distracto-cat. Little snort, snort. So the White Road of the Moon met 3 of the challenges for me. Read a book with purple on the cover, read a book with over 5 words in the title, and read a book you meant to read last year. The next book I read I used for the challenge of read a book in the same spot the whole time, because it's short, and that's The Little Prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, which is a short fantasy classic that I had never read. And then I was also able to use this for read and watch a book-to-movie adaptation, because there is an animated adaptation of this on Netflix. The movie is only partially an adaptation of the book, and I'll get to that later. I'll talk about the movie after I talk about the book. This was also coincidentally nominated for a Retro Hugo Award in the novella category, which I believe it won. And I was super pleased to have finally gotten around to reading this. This is a very whimsical story that's nevertheless, like, very wise and bittersweet and melancholy, if that combination of adjectives makes any sense. The point of view character, the narrator, is a pilot who is stranded in a desert and meets the little prince who has come to Earth from this very, very small little world that he's from, after visiting a bunch of other small little worlds with only 1 inhabitant apiece. And he hears the story of why the little prince left his little world, and of all of the ridiculous and nonsensical grown-up things he's encountered on his travels since, and also some of the real wisdom that he's learned. It's got a very melancholy, sort of philosophical tone to it, and I think that it's made even more poignant by the knowledge that the author died not long after it was published, sort of uncannily poignant. Now, the animated film that's on Netflix takes a lot of the ideas in this and goes in a very different direction with them. It's basically a completely original storyline set in a contemporary setting about a girl who meets an eccentric character who tells her this story of the little prince as something that happened to him once. The story within the story portions of the film are actually a pretty faithful adaptation. A little bit simplified, a lot of things left out, like you get in a lot of film adaptations of books. This is a very short book, but then it's turned into an even smaller portion of the movie. But for what it is, those scenes are pretty faithful. That story within the story of the movie is also done in stop motion animation, whereas the rest of the film is computer animation, and I think that most, if not all of that stop motion animation is done with paper, which is very cool. The movie also makes direct use of a lot of the classic illustrations that are in this book, which is very cool. I haven't shown you any of the illustrations. Here's what they look like. I don't remember if this one is used in the movie or not, but that's what the style is. They're also both color and black and white images. Some of the black and white ones are smaller. So a page like this will have a little color illustration down there, a little black and white one down here. But mostly the movie is this totally other thing that happens to have an adaptation of The Little Prince nested inside of it. And then at the end it goes on this crazy dream sequence that takes all of the things from this story and does something completely different with them, which, full disclosure, I love me a trippy animated dream sequence. I was here for it. But if you're a purist about this book, that movie adaptation may not be for you. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the movie. I enjoyed the book. I gave it 4 stars. Next, probably the most substantial book I had on my TBR for the reading rush was An Unkindness of Ghosts by Rivers Solomon. Solomon was nominated for the Campbell Award for the 2nd year in a row. I hadn't gotten around to reading this book last year, but I made a priority of it this year. I read a digital version of this book on my Kindle that was from the Hugo Voter Packet. I actually don't remember if it was in this year's Hugo Voter Packet or not. I think the copy that I read was from the previous year's voter packet, the first year that Solomon was up for the Campbell. And I was intimidated by this book because I'd heard a lot about how heavy some of the content was, but if you, like me, are intimidated to pick up this book because of the heavy subject matter, I would say that I still found it to be very readable, mostly because the characters were so compelling, and there's a sort of mystery element to the plot that makes it a compelling story to read. I wanted to keep reading this book even when things that were happening were pretty heavy. Basically, this is a dystopian generation ship sci-fi novel that takes place on a generation ship with a social structure that's based heavily on the antebellum American South. It's basically a slavery system in all but name that's sort of propped up by religious ideology that's very obviously meant to benefit only the upper class. The decks of the ship are segregated by race, with the bottom decks essentially being slave labor, the upper decks being the aristocracy and the ruling class, and then although we don't spend much time with any of the middle decks, I think our understanding is that those are like tradespeople and craftspeople. The main character, Aster, is a young woman from one of the lower decks, and she is a scientific prodigy. And over the years, she's developed a relationship with the ship's surgeon, Theo, who is also a young prodigy of sorts, where she essentially works as his assistant. And he can pull some strings to get her passes and privileges to go places and do things that she otherwise wouldn't be permitted. At the beginning of the book, we learn that the ship's leader is dying, and the guy who's next in line, who I think, if I'm remembering correctly, is Theo's uncle, is expected to be a worse tyrant and crack down on the lower decks, and he also has this personal vendetta against Aster and Theo's relationship. And I loved these two characters so deeply, and I cared so much about their relationship. Aster is neuroatypical, and the way she perceives things colors a huge amount of the book. She is constantly pressing Theo to clarify exactly what their relationship is. Are they friends? And what does that mean in terms of what he owes her as someone who has more privilege than she does? Aster and Theo are also both queer characters. Aster is intersex, which is apparently something that's common, especially on certain decks of the ship. And she's also, I think, bisexual, but primarily attracted to women. And then Theo, River Solomon has clarified that they see Theo, and they wrote Theo as a character who is a trans woman in a society that has no framework for understanding that, who has no opportunities to socially transition. And I think it's very, very clear on the page that Theo is not a cisgender man, but that clarification from the author is helpful. They're both these sort of oddball characters, and I loved them, and I cared really deeply about their relationship. There are also several side characters who are really important to the story and worth mentioning. There are women whom Aster lives with on her deck, one of whom, Giselle, whom she's grown up with and is very close with, has very severe mental health issues. And the portions of the book about her are some of the roughest, I think. And then there's also another older woman whose name I'm forgetting, who is sort of a mother figure to both of them, who's also has a very interesting story. But Aster's actual mother died when she was a baby, and the mystery that Aster is pursuing in this book, that she's trying to find the answer to, is to do with her mother's work. She was a technician who worked with the ship's power source, and Aster thinks that there is some message hidden in her mother's notes and journal entries. In case it wasn't abundantly clear, the ghosts of the title are metaphorical in reference to the past and how it haunts the present. This is in no way like a paranormal fantasy novel, it is science fiction. So there's a lot that I loved about this book. I found some aspects of the ending unfulfilling. At least I found that I wanted to talk to someone about that ending, and I didn't, and I had questions, and I didn't ask anyone my questions, I didn't have my questions answered. I think in sort of the big picture sense, I wasn't certain what the takeaway is supposed to be from the big idea that the generation ship would revert to this very specific, particularly horrific social system. Like, if this is somehow the inevitable default that humanity falls back upon under pressure, if that's the message, then I would have a hard time feeling hopeful about the ending of the book, and I think you are supposed to feel hopeful about the ending of the book. We don't really get any context about how this generation ship's social system was put together, why it came to be, because at this point that's so long in the past that it's sort of receded into myth and legend and folklore, kind of. And with regards to the ending, you know I really like standalones, like really like SFF standalones, but this is one where I almost want a sequel to answer some of my questions, or a companion novel or something to fill in some of these bigger picture things with the world that I think you don't really get necessarily as a trade-off for it being such a great, focused, character-driven book. So I gave an Unkindness of Ghosts 4 stars. This filled the challenge to read an author's debut book. I suppose this could also have counted as a book I meant to read last year, but I had already hit that challenge. Then I think I was running out of time in the readathon, and I realized I wasn't going to make it through everything on my TBR. I didn't have time to read another novel-length book, so I substituted something. I had planned on reading The Cloud Roads for the challenge of read a book with a non-human main character, but I just had to switch that out for something shorter so I could hit the challenges, and I read instead Dragonbreath, Lair of the Bat Monster. I think this is the 3rd book in this Dragonbreath series by Ursula Vernon, which is her first of her 2 big kids series. These are heavily illustrated by Vernon, sort of a combination of traditional and comics writing, like so. And I don't have much to say about this. I think after this I'm going to give up on this series and head instead into Vernon's Hamster Princess series instead. That's her other kid series, and one I think I will like better than these. But this is about a young dragon named Danny Dragonbreath who goes on adventures with his nervous, nerdy friend Wendell, who is an iguana. And in each book they end up going on a different sort of magical journey. There's a bus route that will take you to any improbable place, apparently. And in this one, they find an injured bat and bring it to a cousin of Danny's in Mexico who is a bat researcher. And there's always this combination of sort of science and mythology that's interesting. In this one, the kids and the bat researcher have an encounter with a giant bat monster that Wendell's cousin thinks might be the source of the myth of the bat god Camazotz. So you get a bit of bat facts mixed in with Mexican mythology, and that's pretty much the formula of these books with some kind of broad comedy. I gave this 3 stars, and there's not much more to say about that. And then the last book I read was a novella, also for Hugo reading. This is The Citadel of Weeping Pearls by Aliette de Bodard, which is part of the Julia universe that was nominated in the series category. I had, not long before this, also read On a Red Station Drifting, which is another novella in the same universe, and I had previously read The Tea Master and the Detective as well. And of those 3 novellas, I think this is my least favorite, even though it's sort of the most ambitious. This world has a Vietnamese-inspired space empire, and all of the different stories that take place in this world can be read pretty much in any order as standalones. A lot of them take place in very different time periods in this universe's history, but this does include a side character who is one of the main characters from On a Red Station Drifting, but later in her life. This book has 4 different main point of view characters, and their chapters are each titled The Officer, The Engineer, The Empress, and The Younger Sister. And there's this big political context for what's going on in the Empire. The Empire is on the brink of a war, and then within that you've got these 4 very personal stories that are variously connected to the central story element, which involves this citadel that was founded by one of the princesses, one of the daughters of the Empress, where people lived with incomprehensible types of technology and weaponry that seem magical. And the Empress was deeply threatened by this and felt the need to have the Citadel destroyed, but then the whole thing just disappeared, vanished into space. No one has any idea how it poofed into non-existence. So then there are kind of 2 different centers of the story. There's what's happening at court with this war coming, and the Empress wanting to find some way to bring the Citadel back because that technology and that weaponry could give them the advantage in this horrific coming war. And then you have a young woman who's the engineer out on like a different planet or space station or somewhere, whose mother was on the Citadel when it disappeared, and she is working on essentially this like scrappy unauthorized time travel project to like try to open a portal because she wants to go back in time and find her mother and figure out what her mother knew, if that's why she was sent away before the Citadel vanished. And of course these 2 storylines eventually connect, and there's a lot going on. And there are 4 personal storylines that each have significant emotional gravitas, and what I felt was that we didn't get enough time with any of the 4 of them for their stories to feel really developed and to stick with me. Like, I've forgotten a lot about, like, 2 of the 4 storylines in this book. So yeah, it's extremely ambitious that all of that is crammed into a tiny novella, but it didn't really work for me that well. This also sort of fell into one of my SFF pet peeves surrounding time travel, in which you have a universe in which time travel is not an established part of the world building and how the world works. And then all of a sudden it comes into play in the story for plot purposes. I'm not aware of any other stories in this series that delve into this idea of time travel and how it relates to the deep spaces that are an established part of the world building in this. And this isn't as bad an example of this pet peeve for me as others I've read, the time travel doesn't end up really like solving anyone's problems, for example, and no one's like changing the past. The resolution of this book is, I think, intentionally anticlimactic. I had a theory of where this was going and I turned out to be completely wrong. But this really didn't leave as much of an impact as Tea Master or On a Red Station Drifting did for me. I didn't come away from this having felt as immersed in this world and its culture. And while I want to say that, oh, it could have fixed that problem by being longer and giving more weight to each of the characters' stories, I'm not sure there was enough plot here to justify that. So I gave this 3 stars. It's definitely worth reading if you enjoy the other stories in this series. I wouldn't start here though. And I don't think I actually used this for any of the Reading Rush challenges other than my overall book count. I think I had already hit all of the challenges by the time I read this. So that's it. That's what I read for the Reading Rush. I know it was a long time ago, but let me know if you also participated. Let me know if you've read any of these books or if you're planning to, and tell me what you think. Anyhow, I hope you're having a nice day. That is all. Bye for now.